Hello to everyone who's joining us. My name is Victoria Adelmant, and I'm the director of the Digital Welfare State and Human Rights Project at NYU Law's Center for Human Rights and Global Justice. And I'm delighted to welcome you to our event entitled Poor Enough for the Algorithm, Exploring Jordan's Poverty Targeting System. This event is part of a series of conversations on issues concerning digital technologies and human rights, which we've been running since 2020. Today's event is the 16th episode in this series. In each of the conversations in the series, my colleagues and I interview experts who are doing cutting-edge work on the human rights implications of digital technologies, focusing specifically on digitalization within the public sector. So far within this series, we've looked at case studies such as the European Union's introduction of digital technologies in its border control operations, and issues surrounding digitalized welfare in India, for example. You can find the recordings of all of our previous events in the series on our webpage, and you can also find summary blog posts, additional reading materials, and transcripts on that webpage as well. Our hope is that all of those materials can provide a really helpful repository of information for anyone who's interested in this intersection between technology, inequality, and human rights. And so today we're going to be looking at the Jordanian government's adoption of an algorithmic system within a key social assistance program that ranks applicants from the very poorest to the least poor. So when a person in Jordan applies for the Unified Cash Transfer Program, commonly known as takaful, they must provide detailed information about themselves and their property, which the government then supplements with other information it holds on applicants, and the system builds profiles of people seeking benefits, from how much electricity they use to how much they spend on food each month, whether they own a car, how old the car is, and many other details. The aim is to accurately prioritize funds so that the very poorest receive social assistance, and those deemed not to be as poor as others are excluded from the program. So in today's in-depth conversation, we are going to explore this takaful system, and we're going to ask whether such a system is able to capture the complexities of people's lives and how this approach might be embedding problematic understandings of how poverty is experienced. We're going to ask what's new about this approach and what kinds of alternative approaches might deliver better outcomes. Just a quick note that we're going to use the final 15 minutes of this event for questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And now, without further ado, I want to hand over to my colleague, Katelyn Cioffi, who's a senior research scholar on the Digital Welfare State and Human Rights Project. Over to you, Katelyn.
Thank you so much, Victoria. And it's my real pleasure today to introduce our guest, Hiba Zayadin. Hiba is a senior researcher in the Middle East and North Africa division at Human Rights Watch. She investigates human rights abuses in Jordan and Syria, and her past work has covered Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. This summer, Human Rights Watch published a report entitled Automated Neglect: How the World Bank's Push to Allocate Cash Assistance Using Algorithms Threatens Rights, that examined the algorithmic system used in Jordan's takaful program. The report draws on interviews that Hiba conducted with applicants and beneficiaries, government officials, community activists, as well as an analysis of World Bank documents. Human Rights Watch found that this algorithm is leading to cash transfer decisions that deprive people of their rights to Social Security, and that the formula of this system flattens the economic complexity of people's lives into a crude ranking that pits one household against another, fueling social tension and perceptions of unfairness. So Hiba, welcome, and we're so glad to have you here today. And I'd like to start with a kind of a context setting, and perhaps we can start by setting the takaful system in its international context, and particularly the role of the World Bank. Because in the report, you identify the bank as a key actor within the poverty alleviation system building. And in reading the report, we can certainly see some important parallels with our research on the influence of the World Bank in promoting a certain model of digital identity systems around the world. So my first question is really why? Why has the World Bank been promoting the kinds of algorithmic targeting systems we're talking about here today?
Thanks, Katelyn. First, I just want to thank both of you for shedding light on this really important aspect of human rights issues, I think. And just to also point out that I did this report very closely with my colleague Amos Stowe, who actually, led on the report, wrote it with help from us doing some of the interviews and the research. So back to your question, first, I think it's important to note that the World Bank has long promoted this approach of poverty targeting to social assistance. This idea of directing funds to people and families that are identified as living in poverty, in what the World Bank believes is an efficient way of reaching those most in need. And there's been a huge body of work over the past years that kind of identifies some of the issues or the challenges with poverty targeting. And we're talking now pre-digitization or pre-automation of this approach. And some of these challenges included, that it was expensive, prone to error, to mismanagement, to corruption, that it could exacerbate social divisions and mistrust of the government, and that, overall it was inadequate when it comes to income security. So, the World Bank, while it acknowledged some of these problems, it still insisted that poverty targeting was an effective method and continued to go by it. It views it as the most efficient way for governments with limited funds or limited budgets to fill some social protection gaps. And so it chose to invest even more in these systems, but this time with using technological or data-driven solutions to poverty targeting. And right now, today, the World Bank is one of the biggest development actors in the world that pushes this kind of automated poverty targeting. In the Middle East and North Africa alone, 10 borrowing countries to better or upgrade these types of automated targeting, and the World Bank is growing that investment. So the need for a radical change in how we view social assistance.
Yeah, thanks very much for that context. And looking now to Jordan specifically, could you give us a sense of the context in which the takaful system is being deployed? What are some of the realities and experiences of people living in poverty in Jordan today? What kinds of government programs might already exist to support them? And how does the takaful program specifically, which is the subject of your report, fit into the broader system of social protection and social security in the country?
Absolutely. So Jordan is often quite overlooked, when looked at in relation to neighboring countries, the war, destruction, loss. It's always viewed as this safe, stable country in the region. It's definitely something our government continuously reminds us of, that Jordan is safe, it's stable, be grateful. But really, Jordanians have been, suffering for a long time. We've suffered persistently high rates of poverty and inequality for many years. And, there's rising living costs, very low wages, high unemployment. This is kind of the reality that we live in Jordan. And, while I was doing my interviews for this report, and this was one of those, compared to other issues that we cover in the human rights field, it wasn't that hard for us to find people to interview. We just, I used to walk down the street, talk to people, ask them about what it was like for them, and a lot of people always kind of invoked the same kind of imagery, that it feels like they're they're dying a slow death, or it feels like they are constantly living, on the edge of a cliff. And, there's been a lot of suffering, and you can see that in how most recent protests in Jordan that have engulfed Jordan in recent years have often stemmed from economic grievances. So it's like this slowly bubbling situation in in Jordan. And, I'll give you some stats maybe. The minimum wage in Jordan is 260 JDs. That's around $367 US. A living wage is estimated at 600 JDs, 846 per month. You've got, over 24% of the population under the poverty line. Almost 60% of the workforce is made up of informal workers and daily laborers. Like I said, the situation is quite dire, and partly to blame for that precarity is this comprehensive economic program or economic reform program that Jordan enacted in 2012. And it was financed under a series of IMF loans that were aimed at reducing its debt. Obviously, you asked a little bit about, what was there before Takaful, and in the broader social protection landscape in Jordan, we often relied on subsidies for fuel, wheat, water, and this economic reform program relied on the removal first of fuel subsidies, then bread subsidies, then an increase in income and consumption tax, and an overhaul of electricity tariffs. And all of this was happening without any sort of move to offset these challenges. And obviously, both Jordan and the IMF acknowledged that this would place a lot of pressure on low-income Jordanians, especially. But despite them acknowledging that, between 2011 and 2017, social assistance investment actually decreased. Public spending on health, education, and social protection remained stagnant. So the IMF, it talked a big game about, setting these what they call social spending floors, but these were really just, merely a suggestion and not so much a condition of these loans. And so, post 2018, this was a year another one of these reforms was introduced. Food insecurity in Jordan increased from 12.7% in 2017 to 17% in 2020. And to add salt to the wound, Jordan's debt to GDP ratio actually rose. And the main aim of this was to reduce Jordan's debt. It was only 7 years later, in 2019, that the government finally established Takaful. And that's the targeted cash transfer program that we're talking about today. And that was branded as, aiming to protect people from these adjustments or to offset the effects of these adjustments. And let me be clear, Takaful was a godsend. For people who benefited from it, Takaful was really extremely beneficial. It made the difference between their ability to secure food and other necessities, right at when the pandemic hit. And so it dispersed that first round of cash transfers just as the pandemic hit. So it was a really lucky thing that the Jordanians had this system established. But of course, Takaful was not, it did not nearly reach enough people. Like we said, it ranks eligible households from least poor to poorest, but it has limited funds. So not everybody who's eligible is actually able to benefit from it. It's a limited program, not just because of that, but also non-Jordanians. And that includes, refugees, for example, 650,000 registered Syrian refugees, 500,000 Palestinians without Jordanian passports, nearly 1 million migrant workers, and the non-Jordanian families of Jordanian women, and that's because Jordanian women can't pass on citizenship to their children. None of these were included. In the first iteration of the program, Palestinians and Jordanian families, non-Jordanian families of Jordanian women were included, but then the eligibility was further tightened in the second and third iteration, in the second and third year. And yeah, I think I'll stop there in terms of that. And we can get into a little more about how Takaful works in the next question.
Thanks so much, Hiba. I think that's really helpful context. And maybe, yes, let's go straight to that question of how Takaful works. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about how the system was designed. So to the extent that you were able to gather information about this, can you tell us what data is collected, what variables are taken into account in decision-making within this system?
Absolutely. So Takaful, like I said, is an automated cash transfer program intended to provide income assistance to the poorest Jordanians. It is dispersed through the National Aid Fund, which is Jordan's main social. And so in terms of, so basically what it does first is rank people by eligibility. So, are you a Jordanian citizen? And are you considered to be under the poverty line, which is set at 68 JDs in Jordan. For households that make that cut, then there's an algorithm introduced that utilizes 57 socioeconomic indicators that are applied to people who apply for takaful, and that ranks people from least poor to poorest. So people both fill out this really long, lengthy questionnaire online, and the National Aid Fund also relies on information from various ministries, and they say that they rely, 80% of the estimate is based on their own data, and maybe 20% on the questionnaire. So some of these indicators that they use, and here I'll say, the algorithm is not transparent. We don't really know how the algorithm works. We just know what we know from, what we've researched, from what the government has told us, from what the World Bank has told us. And some of these key indicators that they use are, for example, who is the head of the household. So if it's a female-headed household, then applicants can be more likely to qualify. And I've got the list here because it's a long one, but I'll just give some updates. The size of the household, the geographic area. For example, applicants can be more likely to qualify if they live in governorates where there are fewer job opportunities. Ownership of cars. So if the car is less than 5 years old, then you're automatically excluded from takaful. Businesses, if you own a business valued at 3,000 JDs or more, you're automatically excluded. Certain housing characteristics, certain living expenses, that includes water and electricity consumption. These are the indicators, but each of them has a weight attached to it that is not very clear. So, the National Aid Fund says that, each one of these won't automatically exclude you, but that there's a weight to each of them, and the algorithm kind of figures it out that way. And initially there was a complex equation to determine how much each household got, but most recently the process has been simplified, and now households receive between 40 and 136 JDs per month based on the number of people in the family, up to a certain number. So if you have 12 kids, it doesn't matter, as opposed to 10. I can't remember exactly what the number is, but that's basically how the targeting works.
Thank you so much. It's really helpful to have brought a sort of illustrative list of some of the indicators. I think that gives us a good sense of how this system has sort of been designed and the kind of things that it takes into account. But I think some of the indicators that you just mentioned seem quite simplistic, whether it's kind of housing characteristics, or whether someone does or doesn't own a car. I'm not sure that seems likely to tell you very reliably about a person's experience about poverty. Because, for example, a car might be shared between several families, or it might not be used. They might not be able to afford petrol. So it seems like there might be some kind of problematic assumptions about poverty here that are embedded in some of these indicators. From your research and interviews, can you tell us about how this approach to assessing poverty levels has actually compared with people's lived experiences in practice? Are there examples that you might be able to share with us where this algorithm system has really failed to correspond to the realities of people's lives?
Absolutely. And I think the first one I would get into is eligibility. So that's like the first phase, and then we get into the indicators. So even there are issues. Like we said, you are eligible if you are below the poverty line. The poverty line is set at 68 JDs. That in and of itself is an inaccurate measure of the number of people struggling to make ends meet in Jordan. This poverty line was set in 2010. It does not at all take into account the impact of cost of living increases since then. So that's number one in terms of how they decide who is poor and who isn't. So it goes at that, and that alone is problematic. But then, if we want to examine some of these indicators, for example, I think the most apparent ones in terms of how simplistic they might be are owning a business or a car. And people need their cars for for work, but are barely able to scrape by. There's this, they'd have to pay a lot more into public transportation. Often there are cars in people's names that they don't actually own. So there are these bureaucratic aspects to it. One person was telling me that they found out that they were excluded from Takaful because they own a car, and they're like, that car, I had sold it ages ago to a neighbor or a friend or whatever, but they do that without doing it within the system, because it's expensive in and of itself to go through all of that paperwork, getting to government circles. We're talking in some cases about people in faraway governorates where it's not that easy to get to government institutions that they need to get to. So a lot of the time, it doesn't really reflect that they indeed have a working car that they're using. Others actually have a car, but they don't have enough money to refuel the car, to get it fixed. So it's just this thing that sits outside their house and they don't use. So it doesn't really speak to their lived experience at all. It's the same thing with a business. They say these people are automatically excluded, but even ones who have a business worth less than that, let's say, that would lower their ability or the possibility that they would benefit from it. And it doesn't take into account whether the business is struggling to stay afloat. One street very well known for having all these shops along both sides of the road, and I went there at around noon, and absolutely, I spent at least like an hour and a half there, and nobody was working. People were just kind of visiting each other, sitting around idly. Like businesses are struggling. These people's businesses are struggling, and still they end up excluding someone from their ability to get to benefit from it. Another one is this algorithm's assumption that higher electricity and water consumption indicates that you are less vulnerable. And that's definitely misleading, because poorer households in Jordan actually higher consumption because of really, really cold in Jordan. It's a very dry, cold climate, and we've got these stone houses, and it's so incredibly difficult to get them warmed up. And so a lot of people end up utilizing more. And there was a study in 2020 of house sustainability in Amman, and it found that almost 75% of low to middle income households that were surveyed lived in apartments with poor thermal insulation. So they were more expensive to heat. So it's absolutely not the case that the more you consume, the less vulnerable you are. And at least one of these proxies, and I go back to the eligibility one, discriminates on the basis of gender, and we've spoken about this. I've spoken about this a little bit earlier, when it comes to female heads of household and ones who are actually married to non-Jordanians and whose children are, as a result, non-Jordanian. So when a woman who's got a family benefit from it, but they would treat her as a one-person household, and so they will give her a cash transfer based on that. So that would be around that would be 40 JDs. So she'd get 40 JDs regardless of her the size of her family. And of course, like I said earlier, there's a lack of transparency around how these indicators and sub-indicators interact, and so it often feels like it's constantly changing. One of the challenges that we had doing the interviews was there's a perception. People think that they weren't able to benefit because of this particular indicator. And then you would go and speak to the government, and they'd be like, no, 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 that's not, that doesn't automatically exclude you. It's this or that. And so it's often difficult to know how some of these sub indicators interact.
Thanks so much. I think it's really clear that there are some key oversimplifications that are happening here, and ways in which the design of the system itself just does not, and perhaps cannot, capture the full scope of the realities here. And you've mentioned people being automatically excluded, some households receiving far less than they would really be eligible for. And I want to kind of expand on that a little bit and make sure that we really understand the stakes that are at hand here. So I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit more about what the implications of this system have been for individuals and communities. So what kinds of impacts have people been feeling?
Absolutely. So I mean, yeah, we're talking about people's lives here, right? This algorithm is determining whether somebody is able to make ends meet this month or not, and the flaws in that can have real implications for people living in poverty. There's this, the poverty is not just this static thing. It's the algorithm bases it on this like moment in time, but it's actually cyclical, it's unpredictable. There's this concept, or not a concept, but a phrase that people would say when I said, when I asked them, like, how do you do it? How do you make ends meet? And they're like, نتوكل على Allah, which is basically we depend on God. This is what we do. Sometimes things work out, sometimes they don't. Somebody's got a brother living abroad who this month is able to kind of help them figure it out. And one thing I didn't mention, and this particular concept relates to that, is a lot of people found that the questionnaire wouldn't allow you to even apply unless your income and your expenses match. So the government says, no, there's a 20% leeway, but even that is not accurate at all. And they're like, oh, if people are putting higher costs as opposed to income, then they're lying, because there's no way. But absolutely not. It is incredibly expensive. Rent is increasingly high. There are months where, and I remember the story where a woman had benefited and then was excluded without knowing why. And she's like, I'm not sure what happened. My need grew. She had a third baby, and the baby wasn't accepting breast milk, and so she had to buy formula. That alone kind of tipped the entire balance for her in terms of, there's absolutely no financial resilience. And so, it doesn't take any of that into account. And even the amounts, I mean, we can argue, and we can get into that maybe a little bit later, but are meager and are also not enough to kind of build financial resilience, which is really what we want to get to. And obviously, it reaches very few Jordanians. These unpredictable changes, and that people don't really know why they've been cut from the program or not, also can have a really, have a psychological effect on people. And so, yeah, it's very difficult for it to capture the lived experiences.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, that's such an important point about poverty not being static, yet so many of these systems, that is sort of one of the assumptions within that. But when we're talking about the introduction of these kinds of algorithmic systems, I think something that we try to be really careful about is to try to distinguish what is new here, what is being added, or what's the sort of difference in approach. Is there a sort of step change that's happening from the sort of digitalized system as compared with sort of analog systems of the past? And arguably, the problem of people's lives, the messy complexities of poverty not fitting into application forms, and kind of critiques of the measures that are used to determine poverty levels. These are pre-existing problems. They might be said to be issues that are quite separate from questions about digital technologies, and really this is about quantification more generally, and not really about sort of an automated algorithmic system, for example. But within this system, do you think that there is something new here, something that's happening within the takaful system that you think is unique and brought about by the digitalization or the digital element itself. Really, the kind of the key important question here is, does something change when these kinds of algorithmic systems are introduced in these contexts? Is there a sort of new way of doing things?
Yeah, I mean, I think your first point around, I mean, this has always been an issue, right? And I think the point to make here is that these are inherent issues with the underlying policy. The technology here is just a distraction from the policy issues, right? I mean, this is the problem here is in targeting, is in the targeting of who's the poorest, right? Technology comes in and it's shiny, it's new, it's like, oh, we can make this accurate, we can make this effective, we can make this efficient, but at its base, it's a distraction. And in terms of what's new here, what's new in terms of the challenges introduced, I would say is that opacity that's introduced with the algorithmic decision making. So now it's just even harder for us to understand how they're making these decisions. So there's more complexity, there's more opacity to that process, and there's all these intricate criteria. That raise questions about whether, even the government officials or the IMF or NAF even themselves fully comprehend how it works, right? And so I think, regardless of, what's new here and in terms of how this is, this has always been something that some of these big development actors promote, inherently the problem is with policy.
Yeah, that's super clear. And I think we want to turn a little bit to some of the recommendations, because your research has really demonstrated how the introduction of the algorithmic poverty targeting system has produced a lot of harmful outcomes, both by virtue of it being a targeting system and by virtue of it being an algorithmic system. And those two things are obviously related, but there are different problems associated with both. We've talked about how it kind of reinforces the government's reliance on these faulty assumptions about how poverty is experienced. It leads to exclusions and reductions in payments that may already be inadequate to address some of the needs of individual people, and has had a kind of a really profound impact on people's everyday lives. So, based on this research, on the many conversations that you've had, do you think there are certain changes that should or could be made to the existing Takaful algorithmic system, whether from, a technological perspective or a policy perspective? Or do you think that an entirely alternative approach needs to be adopted in order to really address some of the causes and the problems associated with poverty in Jordan?
Thanks. So, I mean, in this report and in a lot of our other work on social protection, and Human Rights Watch has been, leading a lot of work these days in various different countries on the issue of social protection. I think while we do offer some, I would call them interim recommendations, how you could improve on takaful in the meantime, our main recommendation here is that there needs to be a move away from this kind of targeted schemes, poverty targeting. So we're proposing kind of retiring poverty targeting algorithms in favor of technology that is supportive of universal social protection. And in practice, that means providing support to everyone during vulnerable stages of life, regardless of their income and their wealth. And even from a technological aspect, that simplified eligibility requirements, make it more likely for technology to succeed in as a solution for the approaches to social protection, because it's simple, it's easier. One, there's less privacy concerns, and we didn't really get into that, but I think these poverty targeting algorithms have raised a lot of concerns, and other organizations have worked on this, and we've kind of mentioned it in our report as well. But all of this information sharing between different ministries and different governmental institutions, especially in countries like ours that are authoritarian by nature, and where there's a lot of there's persecution, and so I mean, and surveillance. It's all, it creates these privacy concerns that are legitimate, and so. In terms of how to technologically approach it, but obviously in terms of policy, we think that, universal social protection is absolutely where that investment should be. You're setting people up for success. You're not trying to catch them as they fall or catch them as economic hardship hits, but you're kind of setting them up to be able to deal with that. And the World Bank itself has said that that's one of its main goals, right? I mean, the IMF hasn't, but the World Bank did say that its goal is by 2030, I think, to reach a stage where it promotes universal social protection. And then if we go back to some of the, I think only one interim recommendation here that we'd have for Takaful itself is to include, as you're transitioning to universal social protection, that's an important point. As you transition, the government should remove discriminatory barriers to Takaful. So ensuring that all residents, regardless of nationality, are included within that system. And that's because, under international law, all residents, should be afforded that right.
Yeah, and you mentioned the World Bank, and we talked a bit about the beginning about its role in kind of promoting some of these targeted programs and the use of some of these technologies. But you also mentioned, the role of the IMF in encouraging this kind of broader economic transformation that maybe drove some of the need for programs like Takaful in the first place, and some of the transformation of the poverty safety net that exists. Would you have kind of other specific recommendations for multilateral actors like the IMF and the World Bank? And how should the experience in Jordan be transforming the ways that they work with national governments, particularly when it comes to programs addressed towards poverty alleviation?
Yeah, so some of our calls to the World Bank are similar, and they're, to align their actions with, its actions with its vision, which is what I had initially said, that in 2015, actually, they had endorsed universal social protection, recognizing that it is needed to alleviate poverty and inequality. So, in step with that vision, we have called on the World Bank, and I've advocated with it, to cease financing, developing and promoting these kinds of poverty targeted programs, and to direct their resources and their technical assistance towards information systems essential for universal social protection. And the World Bank, for example, even though it does acknowledge that there are issues with this, like I said in the beginning, have said that it's budget constraints make it difficult for cash-strapped governments, or governments that don't have that have limited funds, to be able to follow through with that kind of thing. And one example that we include when it comes to Jordan, for example, is this estimation that this organization called Development Pathways did, where it projects that the cost of introducing universal child, old age, and disability benefits in Jordan would be around 280 million JDs in the first year. That's less than 1% of GDP. And we even get into, in Development Pathways as well, get into how do you fund that? How would you fund a universal social protection scheme like that? And there are ways. There are existing resources that they could use to grow revenue. Tackling tax avoidance, tax evasion, implementing progressive taxes. And the World Bank and other IFIs, they have a lot of influence that they can wield with governments that they loan to, and are able to guide them to move in a more sustainable direction like that. So I think it is possible. It is possible for governments in the global south to implement this kind of social protection, universal social protection scheme, and the World Bank, can and should support that. And they say that poverty targeting schemes are kind of a stepping stone towards that, but we don't really see how that's the case.
Yeah, perhaps one final question that turns more towards the methodology that you used in your report, and the approach that you took to researching the Takaful system, because certainly these kinds of systems can be very challenging to research. You mentioned how they kind of create barriers to transparency. They make it difficult even for government officials sometimes to understand how decisions are being made. It's difficult to access information about the technology, but obviously they're also at the kind of confluence of economic policy, political decision-making, technological decision-making, and it can be, I think, quite intimidating and quite challenging for human rights researchers in particular to approach these systems and to decide which kinds of methodologies are most appropriate to understand some of the impacts on people's lives. So could you tell us a little bit about how you and the rest of the team went about undertaking this research? You know, what kinds of methodologies or partnerships did you use, and what did you find kind of most effective for both your research and your advocacy?
Absolutely. So we used a mix of, interview-based approach, which is, a cornerstone of HRW's methodology. We did some data analysis of Facebook groups. We actually conducted over 70 interviews between October 2021 and April 2023 with people who are applicants, with individuals seeking support, people who were refused. So there are these, we call them, they're not really libraries, but they're these little shops that help people apply, because a lot of people found it very difficult and very time consuming, and we're a bit technologically challenged in terms of how to apply for it. And so these employees of these libraries or these little shops would help them, so they knew really how to navigate the system, how to mold the answers to the questionnaire to the system as well, so how to game it basically. There were these Facebook groups dedicated to people hundreds of people kind of protesting their exclusion on these groups, people trying to understand what's going on here, why did I get excluded, here's what my situation is like, here's what your situation is like, and they're kind of having all these discussions. And we did these, we analyzed these posts and comments kind of to figure out the appeals process, because there's an appeals process for Takaful that we didn't really get into, but where people are able to appeal why they may have gotten excluded. So we kind of looked at that as well and identified key issues and concerns that were coming up in these Facebook groups. We looked at Jordan's Department of Statistics data, like a lot of that kind of documentation that exists, World Bank documents, IMF, UNICEF, which was also a partner in implementation, loan documents and bank reports. We obviously, we sent letters to the IMF, to the World Bank, to UNICEF, to the National Aid Fund. We met with them. We received responses from them. Sometimes these were a little not so transparent, or more confusing than not. And I'll give you an example. I mean, it was very close to when we were about to publish, and we had a meeting. The National Aid Fund finally afforded us a meeting that we've been asking for. And they did that only because they realized, oh no, they're going to publish the report. We need to know what's going on in there. And obviously we share our findings ahead of time. So we went to that meeting, and they were a lot more forthcoming about some of these indicators and how they worked and all of this, that stuff that does not exist, and we don't know, really how the algorithm works. And again, like we said, they may not know themselves, but gave us a bit more information on how these indicators worked. We're like, oh, I don't think this is right about how the interviewee perceived something. This is what it actually is like. And so, we had to go and scramble to kind of make sure that we reflect that information. And we even reached out to this the Distributed AI Research Institute, because we really couldn't understand the technical description that was being offered in terms of how the algorithm works. And we really still couldn't conclusively tell from that description, and neither could they. And it doesn't use AI in that way, or at least as far as we're aware. So there were definitely some challenges there, given the non-transparency of the algorithm itself.
Thank you so much, Hiba. I want to turn now to the questions that are coming in from the audience, and actually just to pick up on that final piece that you talked about in terms of reaching out to other actors in order to try and better understand the kind of the technical elements of the system. We have a couple of questions that are really going to the question of, how does the system work? And so with the caveats in mind of the difficulties and lack of transparency of understanding how the system works, one person is asking whether generative AI is used at all within this poverty targeting system. And another person has also asked, do human intermediaries within the digital welfare ecosystem impact decisions made by the algorithmic decision-making process? So what's the role of humans within the takaful system?
In terms of determining how it...
In terms of the decision-making process itself, so, how fully automated is this, perhaps, would be the question.
Okay. They don't use generative AI. That's what we know, but I can't really speak to that much in terms of why they don't use it or what it would mean if they do use it. And in terms of the role of humans in determining, you're saying like some of these indicators. I mean, I think the World Bank would say to us that it's really entirely the government making these decisions in terms of, I think choosing the indicators that they believe reflect or capture poverty. So definitely there's a big role here for people within government, within the National Aid Fund, within the ministry that are making these decisions. The algorithm then itself kind of calculates it into a crude ranking, and that's what's a little not very transparent to us. But the indicators that were set, this assumption about electricity consumption and water consumption, certain housing characteristics, this is very much people kind of interpreting what they believe poverty is, and what it looks like. And kind of disregarding that, what we talked about, that cyclical nature of poverty. So the indicators are very much set, by the government. And I'm sure very much in collaboration with the World Bank, although it would rather say that, it's entirely the Jordanian government that's making the decisions on what gets calculated or what gets put into consideration.
We have another question that's about this question of efficiency and the importance of efficiency to governments. And it's, how do you consider the trade-off between the greater efficiency possible through poverty targeting algorithms and the loss of inclusion? And are there any circumstances in which you think a program like Takaful would be worth it to allow the government to be more efficient?
I mean, I really don't think so. I think it goes back to that idea that the policy itself of targeting the poor or ranking people from least poor to poorest, that itself is problematic. That itself is prone to exclusion errors, to inefficiency, a technically perfect algorithm executing a flawed policy is just still going to lead to bad outcomes, no matter what, right? So I think that's why what we've been focusing on, and what our main and key recommendation is the implementation of universal social protection, where there is much less room for error, because the eligibility requirements are a lot simpler. You're talking about people under a certain age, regardless of income, regardless of wealth. And that is what really builds financial resilience, because really at the end of the day, giving someone an extra 40 JDs or 136 JDs, which is the top limit, this month and maybe the next month they don't get that. How is that really building financial resilience? It may get them across. It may mean they don't fall off that cliff this month, but what does it mean for the next month, right?
Thank you so much. Another question as well is really talking about the privacy element that we haven't touched on so much in this conversation, but one person is asking if you can talk more about whether there have been any concrete cases of repercussions in terms of surveillance or persecution relating to privacy concerns that you've found as a result of your research.
So I wouldn't say that we found any direct link between, people being takaful applicants and, being subjected surveillance. But surveillance is pervasive in Jordan, and it's often very difficult to figure out, how they got to a certain conclusion about someone. But it does, just knowing that that's the context within which we work, and knowing that the General Intelligence Directorate has access to a lot of this information just by virtue of how the system works around here, just adds to that, to the concerns. When you have this unified information registry, which is what they had to do to be able to make Takaful, let's say, a little more efficient. And so there's all this information sharing between different ministries. But I wouldn't say that we can even if we wanted to, really focus on that aspect in terms of did people face repercussions directly as a result. I don't think we'd be able to find out, because it's a lot more complex than that, in terms of how intelligence gathering happens in the country. So I think it's difficult, but definitely privacy is a main concern when it comes to these kinds of algorithmic targeting, because it does require that they have access to a lot more information in this one unified registry.
Thank you so much. Now, you mentioned at the beginning, you kind of talked about the context of the World Bank being a key actor in sort of encouraging this kind of approach of using these kinds of systems. And so the implicit there is that this is not a sort of isolated situation within Jordan, definitely within this series of events, of conversations on digital government and human rights. We've covered lots of different case studies around the world in which poverty targeting systems are used in this way. For example, in Colombia, we've talked about a sort of COVID pandemic relief system, for example. But we've got a few different people asking about other countries where there might be sort of similar systems that have been put into place and where similar concerns might arise. I wonder if you could speak to that, about similarities in other countries.
Right, absolutely. So, at the beginning of our conversation, I mentioned that 8 out of 10 countries in the Middle East and North Africa, benefited from these. These include Mauritania, Palestine, Morocco, Iraq, Tunis, Jordan, Egypt, and Lebanon. We didn't, we chose Jordan as a case study. But for example, Reuters did their own investigation into the algorithmic targeting schemes in Lebanon and in Egypt. And their findings were remarkably similar to ours in terms of, in terms of the exclusion errors, how they, the inefficiency that can exist within this. And again, we talk about the inherent, premise of poverty targeting, but also the technological aspect of it. So what we understand is that the issues and the challenges are remarkably similar, but we ourselves have not done, such an in-depth look at another one of these systems in the region.
Yeah, and in one of the other questions, you talked about the kind of the insufficiency of poverty targeting, but we have another question which is asking, whether any improvement in the data or the algorithm or the intervention of well-trained humans might improve the situation, maybe provide some of the kind of interim outcomes that you're looking for?
Yeah, so again, the interim in recommendations that we gave didn't really relate to the algorithm itself. We're not, I would repeat that we're not really concerned with the technicalities of how these algorithms work, because again, our view and our belief is that the premise itself is faulty, right? So our interim recommendations have really only been directed at making sure that it's non-discriminatory, because Takaful, on top of everything else that we've discussed today in terms of the challenges that exist, is discriminatory in nature by not including all residents of Jordan in it. And we're talking about some of the most vulnerable populations here when we talk about registered Syrians, Palestinians without national numbers or without Jordanian passports, and the children and families of Jordanian of Jordanian women, and also, migrant workers. These are the most vulnerable, and they're completely excluded from the very beginning, just by, by virtue of eligibility requirements, they're just not eligible for this kind of program. So, that was really our main recommendation. Main interim recommendation is just, make sure you include them as you phase out this program and bring in, universal social protection.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I think that's a wonderful place to end and to wrap up. So thank you so much, Hiba, for your time today and for this incredibly rich discussion. I think this has been extremely enlightening. So thank you very much. Thank you to our audience as well for joining us. And thank you, Katelyn. I hope you all join us again for an event in the future. And best of luck with the rest of your work as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I had a great time. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.